Right, thank you.
All right. Hey, everybody. This is a workshop, so I don't have to use the gavel. Who's around? Looks like everybody. So let's start up. So first one, we want to invite the Community Preservation Corporation in, who have some expertise, and I thought they might be able to talk to us about housing stuff, and we could ask them some questions. So Chris, you want to introduce Doug?
Yeah, so we have Doug Olcott online with us, and thank you, Doug, for joining us tonight. The Community Preservation Corporation is a private not-for-profit mortgage lender and investor specializing in financing low-income and moderate-income housing. They've worked with various levels of government to preserve and develop affordable housing, focused on New York, but they also do work in other states. And they have, in their 46-year history, they have rehabilitated or constructed or helped to fund that more than 182,000 affordable housing units. Doug is somebody I met in a former life when I was with the Congressman's office, and he has extensive experience in planning, community preservation, and housing development, originally working with New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, and then followed with Orange County Office of Community Development, and then he's been working with CPC since 1994 and is responsible for all of the loans originating in the Hudson Valley and New Jersey regions. And they have done quite a bit of work here in Beacon, which I'm hoping Doug will maybe mention at the beginning of his remarks. So Doug, thank you for joining us, and you want to maybe just talk a little bit of what you've done in housing in Beacon?
Yeah, sure. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I started in 94, and that was the year, I think Ron Sowers bought his first building on East Main Street. That when we started in Beacon, all those buildings on East Main Street, which are the beautiful historic mixed-use buildings, those were all vacant shells back when I started. And Ron and Ronnie Beth Sowers bought a couple of buildings down that way and kind of started the whole Beacon Renaissance. And we got involved with not only Ron and Ronnie Beth, but the Ann Saylor from the Dutchess County Planning. Coincidentally, in 92 or so, they launched the HOME program, which is a federal block grant program for affordable housing that counties are eligible to apply for and receive. And I actually met Ann a couple of years earlier than that because I was the director of community development for Orange County, and we were doing some stuff in Newburgh on our side of the river, and she was doing stuff in Beacon on her side of the river. And then when I started working for CPC, we decided to just continue to work together on, and we just sort of marched down Main Street. And, you know, some of the other property owners, you know, Ron Sowers took under his wing, and most of those were mixed use and mixed income projects, because we didn't really want to do all affordable units on Main Street. So most of them had storefronts, and then, you know, maybe, you know, half of the units would be market rate, and the other half, the units above the stores, would be income restricted to 50-60% of the area median income. And that's kind of how the Beacon Renaissance started, of course. When DIA came along, that helped quite a bit too, but it started, in fact, I remember when Ron had renovated his first building, and I don't know if you guys remember when they filmed that Paul Newman movie, Nobody's Fool. Yeah. They had to actually doctor up a couple of the buildings that Ron and Ronnie Beth had renovated because they looked too nice, and they wanted them to look run down, the movie. But anyway, so fast forward, you know, whatever it is, 28 years later, you know, we're still working in Beacon. We're financing the Rodney Weber, Edgewater Development, which as you all know, is 10% affordable units. I believe that's 70% of the area median income. And we do a lot of, there's a lot of inclusionary zoning ordinance that have been drafted in municipalities. It kind of started with the lawsuit in Yonkers, the fair housing lawsuit, and then most of the communities in Westchester County where we do a lot of stuff, they adopted like a standard 10% affordable set aside at 80% of the area median income. That was based on kind of like the HUD approved zoning law. And so we've done a lot of stuff, and that has sort of spread to other municipalities further up the Hudson Valley. And I know, Beacon has their inclusionary zoning ordinance on the books, and I understand from Chris and the mayor that you guys are considering amending that and trying to go for kind of like a deeper affordability and require, I guess, a 60% area median income. And I guess the question is, should that come with pilot incentives or not? And I think what you have to do is kind of look at projects kind of like on a case by case basis, and it is getting harder and harder to make the numbers work on these deals because the cost of construction with all the supply chain issues, and also now we're in a rising interest rate environment. Whenever interest rate goes up, that means you can borrow less money because we loan against the cash flow of the building, and we have a debt service coverage requirement. So if it costs you, more on a monthly basis to borrow the same loan amount, then if that's going to create a cash flow issue for the building, then we have to lower the loan amount that we commit, which means the borrowers have to put more equity in. So I don't know if there's like a right or wrong answer to like whether you should include a pilot incentive. I certainly think if you go, above 10% of affordable units, it's something. We do as Chris mentioned. I also do a lot of lending in New Jersey, and they have kind of like a standard there, where they have a standard pilot that they offer to developers that are going to do 20% affordable, and those are typically those 20%. That 20% is typically a band of different income eligibility, anywhere from 50% of the area median. I'm looking at a deal right now in near Princeton, New Jersey, in Lawrence Township. And they're proposing, I think it's a 44-unit new construction. They're proposing 20% affordable, and some of the units are at 50% area median income. Some are at 60, and others are at 80, I believe. So you kind of have to look at it, on a deal-by-deal basis, and I think you should be open to offering a pilot where it's needed.
Hey, Doug, can you just tell everyone what a pilot is?
Oh, I'm sorry. A pilot is a payment in lieu of taxes, and it's a standard tool that's used in affordable housing because the developer who's building the project is giving up income because he's agreeing to set aside units within the complex which are income restricted and therefore below what he could get on a market basis. So if you, and of course there's a law in the books called 581A, which means that local assessors have to take into account the lower net income that an affordable housing project would receive when doing their assessment. And a lot of times that can be codified into a pilot agreement, so it's kind of more cut and dried rather than, an assessor looking at cash flow statements every year, trying to determine what the assessment is. It's sort of agreed on, I think pilots are often misunderstood, because everybody thinks, well, we're giving away the store and the developer's getting a windfall. But if you do look at it on a case-by-case basis, and provide what a project needs to make it viable, and you're not really giving away the store because you're getting something back from the community. You're getting affordable units for, teachers and firemen and policemen and everyday workers. And the area median income is also often misunderstood because it's, people think that, it's going to be like some kind of housing authority project or it's really, it's looked at it typically on a county basis, and in Dutchess County, the median income I think is over $100,000 a year. So, you're talking about people that are making, households that are making, $60,000 to $75,000 a year. So it's, it's really, we call it really workforce housing, rather than affordable housing. So, that's my 2 cents on your plans for inclusionary zoning. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a great idea that you are trying to reach a lower band of affordability. I think that's a pretty progressive idea, but I think you do have to look at to see how that affects the financial feasibility of each project as it comes along.
Yeah, Doug, the part I learned in having a conversation with you all was there's sort of like 3 numbers, which is what's the percentage of the units that would be affordable, and then what's the percentage of the AMI, because as you go lower, like 60% AMI as opposed to 70, what that means is it's just less income for the rent roll. And then the third number is then whether you're providing any benefit to offset, right? And our statute is 10% affordable units at 70% AMI with no benefit at all. And I guess what I heard talking to Mary was the no benefit at all was a little unusual for us compared to other places.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot. One of the cities that has really done a lot with the inclusionary zoning, and they've built relatively large, complexes. They rezoned the whole area around the train station in New Rochelle, where they had like a lot of underutilized sort of industrial property that they wanted to see mixed-use development on, ground floor storefronts and mid-rise apartment buildings above that. And so what they did was they offered IDA benefits to anyone that wanted to, and IDA benefits could include a pilot, of course.
And you'll tell us what an IDA is, right? Because I'm just trying to get the terms.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, sorry, Industrial Development Agency.
Yes.
So I think probably the county has an IDA.
Yeah, we do.
Probably has one. I don't know if the city of Beacon does. I know Newburgh does.
No,
we don't.
You do not.
Yeah.
So basically they had New Rochelle had an industrial development agency, and anyone who wanted to go ahead and build an inclusionary zoning project, they would offer them IDA benefits, which included, sometimes it included pilots, other times it just included, kind of a reasonable assessment. It wasn't even necessarily codified as a pilot, based on, the numbers in front of the assessor at the time. And then the other thing you can get from the IDA benefits is you can get exemption from sales tax on construction materials, and you can get sales tax exemption on mortgage recording tax, which could be a big number in a large project, because typically counties charge anywhere between 1% and 2% of the loan amount that's being recorded. Well, it's a state mortgage recording tax, but for some reason it varies by county. So, you can also help projects with the financial feasibility by also offering them those kind of benefits. and obviously with sales tax, exemption from sales tax on construction materials could be a really big number. So that's something you may want to consider either working with the county on, or like I said, a lot of cities are forming their own IDAs. But that's another way to really help promote, affordable housing, and this is sort of like mixed income development, so that you seem to be wanting to do in Beacon.
Cool. Questions from council?
I have a question. Do pilots only work for buildings with more than 10 units? Because if it has less than units, you mentioned 20% of affordable housing, but less than 10 units, that would only be 1 unit with the 20% of affordable housing. And then, if so, what developments would that apply to within the city of Beacon?
Well, I don't know what your zoning is. Do you have a minimum, I don't know your exact code. Do you have a minimum, like I know in New Rochelle, the inclusionary zoning only applies to projects that have, I think, 10 units or more.
Yeah, so we're the same right now.
That's where we are.
Yeah. So if it was smaller than that, you wouldn't have an inclusionary zoning requirement, so you probably wouldn't offer a pilot benefit. If I understood the question correctly.
Yep.
Sorry if I didn't.
And it sounds like one of the things that we should do as a step is get a hold of the county and talk to their IDA folks and their planners about what they're thinking, because they've also started a housing fund, and that's the only place we've got the IDA is at the county level.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely something you should pursue.
What is the reasoning for trying to support the developer in the project? Why would the government be doing these? I forget what it's called. The pilot. What did it stand for again?
Payment in lieu of
taxes. Like, why would we do that? I mean, if we had a requirement for, let's say, 20 or 30% affordable housing, it's on the developer to conform with the law if they want to build here, right?
But they just won't build.
So?
The numbers have to actually, work in order to get any construction. So if you want any affordable housing, it kind of has to make economic sense to whoever's building it.
They won't get financed either.
Yes.
Yeah, like I said, it really comes down to like financial feasibility. I mean, you can require whatever you want, but if it's not financeable, then you're going to probably be shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. But
so we learned in the Dutchess County housing study that we need housing for folks making $50,000 or less. I don't know how that converts to the AMI percentage. For like an area of affordability that I've been looking at is below that 50,000 and just above the Section 8 requirement, because what stories that I've heard are folks are turning down jobs so they can maintain their Section 8 status because there's no apartments in Beacon where they can move to if they did a little better, which means that their kids have to be moved to another school district and all this other disruption. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, what have you seen successful models that have a requirement that's in the league of that $50,000?
$50,000 is the maximum income?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, it really varies, like that income level is just like all over the Hudson Valley, there's different, every county has a different median income. So $50,000 in Westchester County would be, below 50% of the area median income. So, but land costs more there, and it tends to be a little more expensive to build down there. You have more union activity. So it really depends on the municipality. It's hard to really say, like, well, does it work with $50,000 that may work for Beacon. But if you're going to do that as what your target is, then that is going to be probably pretty low. I forget what the median income in Beacon now is in Dutchess County. You guys maybe know off the top.
I think it's 86,000, just under 86,000.
Yeah. So, 50 divided by 86 is what? Yeah,
60.
you'd be below. You'd be like, that would be roughly a little bit shy of 60% AFI. So that could be a good target number in Beacon. But I think you have to weigh whether you would offer. And I'm not even saying you would have to even offer a pilot agreement to specific developers on that. But I think you should consider how you assess the property, and that it's done under the 581A legislation, which really takes into account a lower assessment for reduced income on a property.
And I was wrong. It was 81,842, so it's actually less than I had.
Around 60%, yep.
So
Done.
hypothetically, if you financing Edgewater properties, if we had that at, if we were trying to create housing for that $50,000 range of residents, would it be feasible for you to finance that, or would the numbers not work on that project? Just as an example.
I don't know. I mean, I'd have to take a look at it. It's hard just to say that off the top of your head. I mean, you have to like run the numbers and see where you land. I mean, there's going to be a certain point where, I mean, most developers, are looking to the equity in typical multifamily real estate housing deal is somewhere between 20 and 30%, with financing somewhere between 70 and 80%. And once a developer has to start putting in more than 30%, his returns on what is a relatively risky investment, get less. And once you start getting above 30% equity requirement, then developers maybe start backing away from doing the deals. So the answer is I don't know. The answer is I don't know the answer to your question, but.
When you say back away from the deal, you mean sell the land to someone else who wants to do a similar project? What do you mean back away from the deal?
Well, they may not want to do a deal where they have to put in more equity than they had planned because of the returns. Whether they would sell that or try to go back to the drawing board, I don't know. I don't know. It just. At some point it becomes a disincentive for people to build if the requirements are, the more requirements you put on the affordability, the more you have to kind of look at the other side of the equation and see if you're going to be able to balance it out with the tax, with the taxes on the expense side.
Doug, you mentioned the 50% affordable, 50% market rate that you developed years ago. Well done, by the way. Are there compliance, that might be the wrong word, are there periods expiring? Are they still required?
Yeah, I mean, some of those may be expired now. I think what the county was doing with the home fund, since it was a 20-year affordability requirement, typically. So some of that may have expired. Those were more deeply affordable. Those we could do those at 50% affordable because of the county funds that were in, which was essentially structured as a 1% interest-only loan for up to 30 years or whatever, and then. I think they would typically have a minimum affordability of 20. And some of those may have been 30. I don't know. You'd have to ask Ann Saylor. She's the one that structured the affordability requirements on those. And I don't remember. And some of the different deals may have been differently depending on the level of subsidy that she provided.
I will. I mean, I think that when I review the Housing Trust Fund, the Dutchess County Housing Trust Fund, eligibility requirements, that if there are any that are not yet expired, that could be a sweet spot for Beacon to find access to that housing trust fund money. What Councilmember Dan was describing is going to be a barrier for us, that 50,000 and below, and I think George was echoing that as well because of just the cost of things around here. So in looking at the housing trust fund, and we're going to talk about that later, but in looking at their different programs and their eligibility requirements for each of those programs, and I think all of us are just going to be looking for, is there a spot that we can avail ourselves of any of those funds?
And if I could just clarify, the report has a gap in rentals at 2 levels, and it's not 50,000. The 50,000 is for home ownership. So the county identified that there's a deficit of rental units affordable to households earning less than 35,000. And they also identified a deficit of rental units matched to households with incomes at or above 75,000. So they found adequate. They're saying there are not enough units that are expensive enough to take up 30% of the monthly income of these high-income renter households. And what that ends up doing is, instead of them renting an apartment that's at their income level, then they're shopping for less expensive apartments, basically constraining that part of the market. So that's on page 21 of the housing needs assessment. I just wanted to clarify that, Doug, so you knew the numbers. They're below 35 and above 75 is where we're missing a lot of units.
So I think as a council, though, I was just doing a little bit of research, and I think that we also need to make emphasis on housing for people who make less than 56,000, and I can get into that in a second. But I was just cross-referencing what is available through all the resources that any average Joe would look through: apartments.com, Zillow, Apartment Guide, all the real estate agents in the city. The Craigslist, I never said that already, but there are approximately, from what I counted, about 40 units available within the city of Beacon limits. And when Chris gave us the total number of registered rental units in the city of Beacon earlier this year, from the building department, that number was 2,888. And with the data from the county, the housing needs assessment report did show a large deficit in affordability for those who make more than 75,000. But it also says on the very next page that a rent burden household is one that's spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And just going through the available properties of what is in Beacon now, the limited available properties to rent, the cheapest one at first glance was $983, which actually wasn't available, and then the next one was $1054, which was also in Tompkins Terrace. So that was capped with a certain income eligibility. So then the next cheapest apartment in Beacon was $1,400, and in order to not be cost burdened to afford a $1,400 apartment in Beacon, you have to be making that would be 30% of your income, and so doing that math, you'd have to be making more than $56,000 a year. And so I think as a council, with the limited amount of housing that is currently available right now, we need to be we not only need to be focusing on creating affordable housing for people that's less than $56,000 a year. Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But we also, I'm sorry about that.
Can I pick up while, are you?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay, so no disagreement, Chris, you're absolutely right. The report is referencing what is driving up competition, right? However, the report does say the greatest levels of need exist in renters earning under $50,000 a year. So that's on slide 12.
Sure.
So it's both things. Okay. It's the perfect storm, and I think we're all singing to the choir, because we know that that's the situation. But your point is well taken. It means we can get at the problem in different ways.
Right, like the mayor and I had a conversation with the Beacon Housing Authority, because they serve that below 35,000 income. I mean, there's people in there that have much less income than even 35,000. And we talked to them about perhaps them considering a scenario where they build over their parking lots. Again, like we had talked about that for Main Street. And they did invite developers to put in requests for qualifications, and they've been working through some ideas with those developers. I don't know that they'll go for it, but if they do decide to go for it, we would have to go back and change some of our zoning to allow it. And again, I don't think at this point we're talking about another 8-story building, but perhaps a 3-story building or a 4-story building, or again, they'll try to size it appropriately. But we said to them, you know, even if you can create another couple dozen units, that really makes a difference here. So.
That being said, I think, just jumping back, we do need to make sure that there's units available for people making less than $56,000 a year, because if a renter right now in Beacon loses access to their housing and they're making less than $56,000, their only options are to go on a wait list or to move out of Beacon, or maybe they'll get lucky. But we are at a serious deficit of just available apartments in Beacon in general. And I mean, the state defines a housing state of emergency as having less than 5% available, and 5% available apartments of 2,888 is 144 units. And we are far from that amount of available units in Beacon, and absolutely far from that amount of affordable units in Beacon.
So is there a question for Doug? Because we've got his expertise now, so I just want to make sure that we're kind of leveraging that for information.
Yeah, Doug, to go back to what I think George was asking, I'm wondering if either you yourself or know someone who has the ability to, you talked about things happening on case-by-case basis, to do some adjustments to the numbers that you use to fund things like Edgewater or other properties that you've worked on in Beacon, to look at, well, what if we had an AMI requirement of 50% or 60%? And what that would have meant at the time. I appreciate interest rates have changed. This is not perfect math, but as close as you could get to when you had funded it, if we had that, I think that kind of information would be useful, because to answer what I think Dan was asking was, why do we want to do this? You know, to build off what Justice said, if this gets us the kind of units that do meet the need in Beacon for those who can't afford to pay more, that to me is a reason to do it. And then once we know, if the numbers don't work, then what are our options? What could we offer in tax incentives? I don't see a reason currently to change what we have on the book. I don't see a dearth of developers able to make that currently financially feasible. I appreciate interest rates have only recently changed, so maybe that is also about to change. But I think if we could lower the AMI or potentially increase, or in combination increase the percentage of inclusionary zoning, that might be a reason to do pilots or other options that we have. So my question to you, Doug, is it possible to do some of that math and give us some more hard data on some of the case-by-case basis that we've actually seen here in Beacon, to take it out of the theoretical?
Yeah, I mean, Mary Payton could not be here tonight, but she's the loan officer for Edgewater. So I could ask her to run the numbers to see how that would have affected the loan at the time, if you had if you're asking me if I'm understanding, if you had a 60% AMI requirement instead of a 70, and how would that have affected our loan? Is that
yes, that's correct, yes.
Oh yeah, that would be easy enough to do.
I think,
I can't do it right now.
No, that's fine, thank you.
I think I'd also be interested in not just what it would be at 60 AMI, but if there is this sort of, what I'm imagining to be a matrix of multiple income levels, but a higher percentage of them, if that makes sense. Right. So 10% at 50, 10% at 80, or whatever, the matrix of math is.
I really like the
if
idea of
you-
doing
I mean,
that.
if you gave us, whatever matrix, whatever you wanted to look at, we could, if you wanted to use that project as kind of an example, we could see how that affected, if you went up to like 15% affordable or something like that. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I would love to get to 50.
He said 15.
He said,
One
oh,
five.
15.
50, you'll never have another development in the city.
Generally,
Hey, he said it. He did it before.
Generally,
that was
what
financed
I've
by
seen
state
out,
funds.
in the Hudson Valley in New Jersey is typically the inclusionary zoning is anywhere between 10 and 20% affordable. Once you get above 20% affordable, you kind of need something beyond a pilot. Then you're probably looking at, a tax credit type project like what Ken Carney built on West End Lofts. That's 100% affordable because, well, the first phase was, second phase was market, but the first 75 units that he built there are all affordable at 60% AMR or less. But he got tax credits from the state and he got capital subsidy from the state to bring down his costs because we can't afford a market rate type loan. The inclusionary zoning stuff where you have 10 to 20% affordable, you can usually make that work with just conventional financing and perhaps some tax incentives. And the other thing I've seen is I don't know, is your zoning ordinance include any kind of density bonuses if you provide
No.
affordable
No.
units?
It's recommended in our comprehensive plan, but it's not on the
No.
books.
So, yeah, we're
Density bonus.
straight 10%, 70% AMI, no tax benefit, no bonuses. Right? My impression listening to you is to go above 10% or kind of drop below 70, we're at kind of the phase where we've got to provide some kind of benefit, whether it's, a pilot or something. And then if we go, and then the other thing I heard you say is if you want to go well above that, well, then you need state tax credits or you need state bonding or you need something else because the numbers don't
Correct.
work, right?
I mean, the exception would be if we develop our own land. So the idea at some point of doing parking lots, you're taking one of the major upfront expenses off by selling it for a reduced value or $1.
Yeah.
Well, I'd rather do
Yeah.
that and then, writing checks to developers. I would rather the
We're
city.
not writing a check
Yeah.
to a
Or
developer
whatever
with a
the
pilot.
benefits
I mean,
would be, yeah.
you have pilots for Tompkins Terrace,
Mhm.
for the two facilities out on Matawan.
Mhm.
So a lot of your housing, your affordable larger housing development is already under a pilot
Mhm.
from years ago.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I don't know how it works, but it sounded like to me we were trying to provide incentives to the developer, and they were financial incentives, which is what I really was referring to.
And the other thing I would say about pilots is a lot of times they could be a net benefit depending on the site to the municipality because typically if it's underutilized land and it's just sitting there, you're not making much, in terms of tax revenue on it. Whereas if you provide something that makes sense, it's not giving away the store, but providing some type of incentive, then you're putting the building for that land on the books at full, at the highest and best use, fullest value, and that can actually be a net benefit to the municipality. Obviously, you've got to take into account school tax and the burden on the schools, but you can do that kind of cost-benefit analysis too.
Doug, I have a couple of questions. One is if you could talk to the council about how supportive or special needs housing might help make numbers work better or differently. And the second question is, has CPC done any investment in naturally occurring affordable housing?
Yeah, the second question is the easiest one to answer. 80% of the loans that we do are what we call small A, or naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's typically where you're going into low and moderate income neighborhoods, and you're providing capital primarily for the renovation of existing buildings, but also to do smaller infill type projects. And you're just doing them at the market, and the market bears what the people in that neighborhood can afford. So we do a lot of that type of housing. And now that I answered the second question first, I forgot this first one. Remind me the first one.
Supportive or special needs?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of state programs that provide incentives for doing special needs housing. And those are typically combined, well, not always, but on larger projects, they're typically combined with the state tax credit program, and then the Office of Mental Health or the Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, they have their own pots of money which they can put in to help incentivize that type of housing. And, you know, I think in Dutchess County, you know, Hudson River Housing, I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They're one of our longtime partners. They also have done, market rate, you know, in Poughkeepsie, we've done a couple of renovations of vacant buildings where they have gotten what they call ESHI funds, which stands for Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative. And they have worked with private developers to renovate buildings. We did one on Maple Street in Poughkeepsie. It was 20 apartments, and Hudson River Housing master leased 15 of the 20 apartments for their clients, and the rents were then subsidized through the ESHI program, and they put in, you know, people that had developmental disabilities and such, you know, their clients, and so that was kind of a successful way to use funds. So there are ways if you want to, you know, and that's a big need out there. You know, when we also did another project with Ken Carney in Poughkeepsie that had a set aside for veterans housing. So yeah, I mean, there are definitely programs out there to help support that.
But my understanding from the first question is that it wouldn't necessarily, naturally occurring affordable housing initiatives wouldn't really work in an area like Beacon?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's the thing with Beacon, right? It's kind of gentrified now. So it depends on, you know, the situation for a particular building. If someone's going to go and buy a building from another developer and pay market price, it may be difficult to fit in a rehab scope. However, if it was a long-term owner and you didn't have those acquisition costs and he wanted to just upgrade his building and maintain the, you know, the affordable rents that he had in place, then that might work. So it really depends on the situation. You're right, it's more difficult in areas like Beacon that have become gentrified and where building prices and land prices have gone up so much. You know, when we started back in '94, you could buy a vacant shell on East Main Street for 50 grand.
We sold one for $1.
Yeah, I remember. Okay, you want to wrap up? Because we've been
I was
picking his
actually
brain for a while, so.
hoping to tease out that last idea a little bit more, if that's okay. This possibility, if I understood what you were saying correctly, that a long-term owner who might want to upgrade the building but maintain affordable rates is the kind of person that you would be able to loan to?
Yes. That's actually that's kind of our bread and butter.
And are there pilots that would need to be involved in something like that? Or is that just a straightforward loan on your books?
Typically, that kind of housing does not, you know, merit a pilot or qualify for one. It's really, we work with a lot of guys that are contractors themselves, small developers they start out as general contractors, they buy a small building, they do a lot of the work themselves, so they don't have a lot of overhead. So like those are the kind of guys that we like to do business with, that know how to buy buildings right. They buy buildings that are distressed or that they can usually get for a better price because there's some kind of issue down, either the building's, needs upgrades or it's on a block or a neighborhood that's not quite turned the corner yet. It's emerging so that's more where we get involved. To be honest with you, like over the years, we have done a lot less in Beacon than we did back then, and that mainly speaks to the price of buying real estate. And people, after DIA became a reality, then a lot of people started coming up from New York City and artists and such, and people were paying too much for buildings. Really, they kind of overheated the market, and then that prevented us from doing more renovations because there's only so much that you can afford to finance in a property. So if you pay too much for the acquisition, it doesn't leave enough room for a rehab scope if the building requires upgrades. So.
Right, which is why this would be for rehab loans as opposed to a new building or a new owner. Is there a minimum size unit that you work with?
Well, generally we like buildings, we like, anything from studios to 3 bedrooms. We're not, single room occupancy buildings we're not crazy about, like everybody to have their own kitchen and bath.
I think Paloma's question was the number of units in the building.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant the size.
I'm sorry.
Size of the apartment, sorry. No, I mean, anything, generally we do 5 family and up, but because that's kind of like what the multifamily market is defined as, 5 family and up, because, if you're 1 to 4, sometimes you have an owner-occupied unit. We don't really do those. We do investor-owned, but like if there was an investor that bought a 3-family and wanted to just renovate it and lease it up, we could definitely look at that.
I'm sorry, did you say you don't do SROs?
I won't say we don't do them, but typically there would have to be, a lot of times those types of buildings need a social service component. Mm-hmm. So the ones that we have done are with organizations like,
Did you do safe harbors?
We did not do safe harbors, although we did, we were involved with it. Chase Bank ended up financing that in the end, but we were interested in financing it, yeah.
Cool.
But generally if we're gonna finance a single room occupancy type building, we wanna make sure that it's properly managed and that it has, typically there's a social service component that goes with that, or support services for the residents.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, Doug, I appreciate all the time. I knew when I sat down with Mary and then talked to you that you would be an asset that we could start to just ask a lot of questions of. So thank you.
Sure, no problem. It was nice meeting you all, and I wish you the best of luck. And Mayor, if you want to, whatever kind of follow-up, if you want us to run a couple of scenarios off of Edgewater, just send us an email and we'll take a quick look at it for you.
Okay. Very good.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
All.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Okay. As I said, we asked them to come in just because I thought he'd be able to give us just sort of a way to start thinking about some of these problems. All right. Next one is to get to accessory apartments. And we had the public hearing, we left it open, we said we might want to talk about some things, so I just want to open that up. John, are you out there for questions? John Clark?
Yes, he's on.
Okay, thank you, John. We also might pick your brain on some of the topics we were talking to Doug about at another point, so. All right, so any questions after our public hearing?
I thought the comments from the county were kind of interesting, and they said that why are we having it no more than 50%, and maybe we're limiting that. My instinct is that might be a little bit out of keeping with character. We might have a smaller building, but we don't want to have a larger ADU attached to that or have that be as of right. But I wanted to bring it up with the council and see if there were other thoughts or opinions about that. So I'm sorry, to be clear, I'm fine at keeping it at 50% for that reason, but I didn't know if others had some other concerns, similar to what the county raised about, is that tying the hands of those who want ADUs too much.
So, and define the 50%.
Oh, sorry, 50% of the size of the main structure. So right now, we're saying it can be no larger than the total square footage of the main structure of the house.
But, and the county seemed to be also saying that this imposes almost a further restriction on smaller houses, so the bigger, more valuable your house is, the bigger you could make your ADU.
Yeah, I read it in that opposite direction, that we were going to end up with, for those who have much larger properties, quite large ADUs.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're still capped at a maximum size per ADU,
Yeah.
isn't 1,000 square feet? Am I misremembering that? So even if, or is
John?
it?
No, that is correct.
Okay.
So it's up to 1,000, but if you had a building that was 1,200 square feet, you would be limited to 600, so you could not do an 800.
Correct.
Is our law written that could go to the planning board for an exception, or we're saying no?
No, they would have to, at best, they could go to the ZBA for an area variance.
Okay.
And some have it.
Buildings that are over from 1989 and before. That's existing buildings. So the planning board has a little flexibility on really old buildings.
Oh, that was actually, so they did bring up the 1989. I thought that was about existing accessory buildings, like barns. I think of barns.
That's what it was.
But that's not on the main building. So if your main building was built before 1989, that would not qualify for an exception. Did I misread that?
I think the way I read it is that, and the way it's been used, is it's on existing barns or old accessory buildings that are larger than 1,000 square feet or 600 square feet, and that the planning board has flexibility to take advantage of these old buildings. So it's the accessory building that's constructed before 89.
Yeah.
Right.
I had a question related to the 1989, but I didn't want to leave the percentage of the principal dwelling question first, in case others had thoughts.
And let me just understand it. So if there's an existing, 1,500 square foot house, could you take 750 of that and make it an accessory? Or could you, or would you be building an extra 750 and then the total would be 2,250? Does either of those work, John?
That's an interesting question. The accessory unit can be up to 50% of the building, yes. So 750 could be either inside or outside the building.
Okay, so that says, yeah, if you had a 1,500 square foot home, you could basically, make two 750s out of it without changing the footprint, or you could add 750 to the 1,500.
Or have it be a separate structure.
Yeah, or a separate structure, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm.
There's an advantage to, we took the percentage and upped it to 50 to give them more flexibility. But you could take it off and just limit it to 1,000. 1,000 is not as much as most single-family houses. There might be a few that it would apply to. But it does, everything that makes the process simpler and less reason for variances, I think is a good thing.
Maybe then 1,000 is better because you'll still have the setbacks, you'll still have other, if a small house is on a small property, they can still only build so big on that property. So I don't know if we need the percentage if the maximum is 1,000.
I agree with that.
Okay.
I think the setbacks cover a lot of this.
Right, because if you don't meet it, you need a variance, and then that's going to get a review, and that's
Right.
going to increase cost too.
Right, so you still have that option if you're really keen on it and have a reason, but then you go through the current process, which is sort of more involved.
Okay.
I also had a question about the second point, which John started talking about, the 1989, which is about the accessory buildings. Is there a reason why August 1st, 1989 is the year? And the county kind of asked the same question too. I'm not sure the county's suggestion of at least 5 years old, I'm not sure with that, but I'm wondering if later than 1989. Is there some reason I'm not aware of?
Is that when the charter went into effect, Lee?
Yes.
Oh, it is, yeah.
The law was adopted.
Oh, right, the original accessory ADUs law. No, that's older than 25 years.
Yeah.
It was adopted in '89, yes.
The original accessory one? I thought it was later than that.
No,
It's my understanding.
I'm taking a look now.
Don't ask me why. I don't have a good one on that one.
Stumped them. You stumped
I
all
know.
of them, Molly.
It's like the county I hadn't thought when the county put it in, and I was like, oh, yeah.
But I think that's right around when you guys went
Adopted
from
the
the
charter.
commissioner form of government
So it's the
to
charter.
this form of government.
Yep, it might be when some zoning got codified, right? Because that's what I'm guessing.
Zoning was codified in '77,
Yes.
Stop it.
but we don't have a good answer.
All right.
Okay.
You stumped us.
Generally, though, I agree with the county's feedback on that, because 1989 will become, I mean,
So,
It's a fixed
I do have
date.
an answer. The accessory apartment provision was added November 20th of 1989.
So that's what allowed you could have them. Okay.
Yes.
Of any. Yeah, I still come back to, could we consider buildings that were built later? Like garages, or the example I know I said barns, but I think garages might actually be more common.
So would the right language instead of 1989 just be pre-existing?
or 5 years like they recommended, maybe?
Yep.
I kind of like the 5 years so that someone isn't building a garage and be like, and then
And then
just
tomorrow,
convert it.
yeah.
So,
Yep.
I'd be open to more than that if there's any concern, or we're going to have public hearings, so if the public, if they see that change and feel, and they have examples of buildings that I'm not thinking of that we want to consider, but yeah, I feel like if the accessory building was approved as a building on the site, then it should be able to be converted into an accessory building, with meeting the other requirements, if there is off-street parking and things like that, that there's enough other constraints around it. Those were the two things that I wanted to talk about.
So are people okay incorporating those two changes from the county?
Yes.
I think that's what you basically proposed.
Yes, that is basically what I'm proposing.
Yes.
So just to review, the first change is a maximum of 1,000 square feet.
And dropping the percentage.
And dropping the percentage of the principal dwelling, 50% of the principal dwelling size rule, as the county describes it in their comment. And then also dropping the requirement, or the August 1st, 1989 exception, and instead changing it to a pre-existing structure that has existed for, pre-existing accessory structure that has existed for at least 5 years old, 5 years at the time of application.
Okay.
And could I just be clear also, the 1,000 square feet, that's a total square foot or a 1,000 square foot footprint? Like if you have 2,000 square foot floors, one on top of the other. Is that legitimate, or is it total?
It's total square foot.
Okay.
I think we changed it from the footprint to the total square
Right.
footage
Yeah.
months ago.
Okay.
So I had two things. I didn't bring this up the last time we had the discussion because we seemed to be focused on the usage tables and on the charts, but I'd like to re-raise the issue of having an affordable housing requirement for any ADUs that are rented out. I think that I don't have any confidence that the market will create affordable units out of ADUs, so I'd like to propose that we have a requirement that any ADU that comes up for, that gets registered with the city as a rental, that it's required to be at 50,000 or less, or another metric that the council decides. But I think we should have a requirement that these units are actually going to be affordable.
So I have an issue with a 100% affordability requirement. We just had someone saying, once you go about 10%, you've got to do some kind of benefit. This is a 100% affordability requirement, which, looking at it from the other perspective, the only people who do an accessory unit are people who do it because they need the money, okay? And the concept of imposing the burden on someone who actually needs the money really doesn't make any sense at all in terms of equity, right? If we want to do something, we as a community should bear the entire burden and not one person. So if we want to figure out how to do that, I'm willing to consider it. But 100% affordability requirement is just basically imposing the requirement on someone who actually needs the money.
I guess it also triggers who maintains that.
Building department.
They would check the.
Well, we could have them review the list of accessory dwelling units. We could have them cross-check I'm sure that they take the applications
financials
for
and everything.
rentals.
I'm going to just say now, that's not realistic. You'd have to have a third-party vendor do it, which would add cost to doing an
It
ADU.
would have to be Hudson River Housing.
You'd probably have Hudson River Housing, but they charge to do that.
Yeah.
Seems worth it.
So what you're basically doing is someone who's of limited means trying to own a house can't buy in Beacon. Remember, there's two groups we need to consider. One is someone who's on the margin in terms of buying, and one is someone who's on the margin in terms of renting. And to pit the one group against the other is really, really inappropriate in terms of our community.
I don't think that what Dan is suggesting is pitting one group against the other, and I mean, the cost of developing, I guess, an accessory dwelling unit already would mean that somebody already does have the funds, and so I think we have to remember that there are going to be people that are working or creating accessory dwelling units to be out of I guess necessity for supplemental income, but there are also going to be people that are doing that because they want to earn extra income, not necessarily out of need.
They want what? Sorry?
They just want extra income, not just out of need.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that's saying that ADUs are typically built by people who are just getting by and need extra income. I mean, if that's the case, I'd love to see that data, but there's people who build an ADU because they want to move their in-laws in, or, their child's coming back from college and they want them to have a place to live, but then when that kid or the, family member leaves at 5 years later, they may want to rent it out. And I would say that would need to be registered with the city, and that should be affordable housing.
We did ask Doug during our conversation between him and Mary Payton and the mayor if he knew of any localities anywhere that did this, and he wasn't aware of any that do this. Mm-hmm. And again, he used, like the term Ren used, of naturally occurring affordability. You may not be creating an affordable unit for somebody at 30 or 50% of AMI, but you're certainly not building a luxury unit. Like what we're building now are luxury units. Any accessory apartment is going to be much more modest in scale and scope. Like when I was on the city council, I actually lived in an ADU in Teresa Kraft's house. She doesn't like to admit that, but she has a two-family. So, luckily, I could afford that on the little bit of money I was making. I couldn't afford a home on my own, and I'm sure it helped with the affordability.
And I would never have a tenant again.
It's because I put that compost pile in, and now she won't get rid of it, so.
It may also, as much as I would like to see it happen, but I think if we impose this restriction on affordability, I think it might have the unanticipated consequence of nobody building them, because.
And we ran the numbers. There's only 29 of these units in the city right now. So you haven't opened any floodgates here. This is on the margins, but it can help somebody. Like when my ex-wife and I were looking to buy a house, we were looking at whether or not it had an ADU in it to help pay the taxes. Like when you're making not a lot of money and you want to buy a place, this is when people often buy multi-units and live in one and rent out the other.
I recognize that ADUs aren't luxury apartments like what is available now in the city of Beacon, but at the same time, back to Dan's point, I mean, with the limited amount of affordable options within Beacon, or just with the limited amount of renting options within Beacon, there isn't really anything stopping somebody who is renting out an ADU to charge market prices.
Yeah, but again, keep in mind that you have a lot of complexes here already that are serving people at that lower income level. I mean, you have Beacon Housing Authority and Tompkin Terrace. You have, what are the two that Peg did on Meadow 1?
Meadow Ridge 1 and 2.
Meadow Ridge 1 and 2. What you're creating here is something for somebody that maybe works for, has a middle income, because those people are being placed out too. Like the people that work for the city are increasingly telling me, yeah, I might make 50 or 60,000, but boy, I can't afford to live here. On an average ADU that we're seeing, you actually could afford, with kind of a public salary or something.
I mean,
So again, not every unit you're going to create is going to be for 30% of AMI, but the more units you create, the less people at that level you have looking for, if they can't find an apartment at that level, they'll grab whatever they can, or they'll leave. So again, creating different levels isn't a bad thing. We're really doing a good job at creating luxury levels, but I think this is not a luxury level.
Well, part of it goes back to the cost of construction, right? So the new units, I was looking at Edgewater, and my impression is the unit there is costing, $200,000 or $300,000 per unit to make, right? An ADU just can't possibly cost that, which is why it becomes what's the term that you used, Ren? The naturally affordable, right? Mm-hmm. It's the one thing that we can do, because I was listening about whether there were places in Beacon where the building is run down. It's like, we're kind of running out of those. This is sort of the only naturally occurring construction that we can do. And I think we should be encouraging it. When you put a price limit on it, you're just discouraging it. So, I mean, unless you're, taking a NIMBY tack and you don't want any, I don't really think you should be restricting them. They're going to naturally restrict themselves, right? A 600 square foot unit directly adjacent to a homeowner is not going to rent for the same price as one of the new 2,000 square foot units.
And not just a homeowner, but a homeowner that is your landlord.
Yeah.
So, I agree that it's a good point that it's not equitable to put that requirement on a single-family homeowner. And I also think it runs counter to the whole spirit of, the planning board. We're looking at this to make it so that we don't have to go to the planning board for every little ADU. It's a building on their property. It shouldn't be so onerous. So this would go back in the other direction and keep people yet again from wanting to do it. I think that we have to put our brain power into building or preserving or rehabilitating affordable housing on a larger scale than we're going to get one at a time in garages.
Yeah, it feels like we spent a lot of time on something that isn't going to be guaranteed affordable housing. I mean, we've been talking about this for almost a year.
But it's
and we're still not
workforce.
willing to guarantee that it's affordable housing. We're just going to hope that somehow the lower square footage is going to maybe be cheaper, and maybe people out of the kindness of their heart will charge below market rate. But
Sorry, I disagree on both counts. So first of all, if I'm living next door to the person, I want the right person, and I'm willing to charge less for it. And that's not a theoretical argument. My family could not afford to buy a house in California. We bought a 7-unit apartment house. We lived in one. We rented out the other 6 in order to afford the mortgage. We always chose tenants who were people that we wanted to live with and always charged less and had long-term tenants. I think you could prove that any day of the week. The other part that I disagree with is the concept that fewer square footage will result in the same price doesn't make any sense at all, right? 600 square feet versus 2,000 brand new. If you find me an apartment at 2,000 square feet brand new and another one at 600 restored that are the same price, I'll buy you dinner, okay? Doesn't make any sense, Dan, come on.
I'm saying 650 square feet equals 650 square feet. I'm not saying that 650 is going to be the same price as 2,000. I'm just saying it'll be market rate for whatever 650 is.
But that'll be less than other apartments in Beacon, which is what we're trying to create. One of the concepts that Chris has proposed 20 years ago, which I really like, is to get our builders to build smaller units. Because if you build smaller units,
You were
even
against that, by the way.
I think, yes.
I just
All right,
wanted
I've come
to-
around in 20 years, right?
Okay, good.
Right? And so instead,
Did you get
one of
that,
the-
Ben? He said I was right.
Right. One of the proposals is that instead of us rezoning by how many units can go somewhere, that we instead think about how much square footage can go somewhere and let someone build smaller units, which by definition will be more affordable and in the lower rates.
And it's also more environmental. I mean, a lot of smart growth advocates are saying, look, we're running out of land. We can't just continue to build toll brother track housing everywhere. We're out of land here. We're essentially built out in a lot of ways. So if you think about how to make something more affordable, you have to have more people be able to use the same amount of land, the same amount of space. And you know, again, I look at these neighborhoods where I lived 30 years ago, and they're a lot less dense than they were because people aren't having as large of families. And a lot of people are like me, a single or a couple, and they just have 1 or 2 kids instead of, you know, a much larger family like you would have seen. So in a way, what you're doing is you're just, it's a more efficient use of both the built space and the land that's available.
They're building, I think, 30 units in Newburgh, micro units, which are about, I think it was about 400 square foot each.
Wow.
And it's subsidized, and it's gone through the city of Newburgh.
Are they for sale or for?
No, it's for rent, and it's income restricted and so on.
See, because the other thing we talked about with Doug is just the dearth of, if you're renting and you want to make that jump to owning, how do you do it? It's really hard these days. And some of the ways people did it traditionally are like Lee's family buying a multi-unit. I bought a condominium, you know, which was really small. That's another way. Some of people who buy a condominium or a townhouse, but we only have a limited number of those. If a unit is a 2-family or has an ADU, you can rely on that income to augment your income. So you may not make enough money to support that house absent that. But if you know you're going to get a rent every month, you know, some of that can go towards paying down your taxes and your mortgage.
I think where I'm hearing some of the conflict in this conversation is that I don't know that we have a shared definition of what affordability means, and that's a question that I've sort of heard our council talk in circles around. And I do see how ADUs create a certain level of affordability to the market overall. Even if they are quote unquote rented at market, they are increasing density and increasing what is on the market. But I think what Dan is talking about, and also what we were talking about with Doug previously, was a different definition of affordable, which is subsidized housing. And, you know, we've had this conversation about subsidized housing versus workforce housing. And while I think ADUs will increase affordability overall, I don't know that I would call them affordable housing. And that's just my personal, you know, term definition. We don't necessarily have a shared definition of those terms on this council, but I just wanted to give that context from how I see it.
Well, and in terms of subsidized, then we're talking about this being subsidized by the homeowner, right?
I mean, I would refer to it more as a moderate income. Doug used, you know, there's low income and moderate income. You know, again, we have a lot of apartments that are low income. They're a huge waiting list, of course, but we're also not serving moderate income people. And this creates another unit that they might be able to rent and another place they might be able to buy.
So the purpose of our, you know, working on this first was we incorporated it 20-some years ago ahead of everybody else. We haven't had a ton, 29 in 20 years, but the idea was to make it easier, not harder. And the idea was to, you know, sort of encourage a little more than 1 a year and maybe get 2 a year or maybe 3 a year. It's not a huge part of the solution, but, you know, to make it harder or to make it, you know, more likely not to happen really doesn't make any sense if we're trying to make it easier, right? So I don't see how this fits in at all with trying to make them easier and encouraging them and trying to encourage a little bit more on the housing stock at the lower end.
Well, I mean, wait, can I just backtrack for a second? Was the goal to create more housing or to create more affordable housing in Beacon? Because, I mean, if we're only going to pop up with 2 to 3 houses or ADUs a year and none of them are even affordable, then does this do anything to actually address the issue?
Okay. You keep saying the same thing again, that it's not going to be affordable. Compared to the new things that we're building, every unit in an existing home at 1,000 square feet or less is always going to be less expensive than the new construction that is going up. You can't afford, without subsidy, to have a brand new construction at $200,000 or $300,000, you know, dollars to build an apartment and rent it out at, you know, a fraction of what it needs to support itself. You can do that with an ADU, right? And you know you're going to get that. Just like, you know, if we build 100 400 square foot units, but they're going to be a lot less than building 100 2,000 square foot units. So we know the answer. You can say, well, I don't have it in front of me. It's not going to be affordable. It's like, you need to build a variety of units. If we had a vacancy rate of 30%, all rents would drop dramatically. So we got to build some stuff and get a vacancy rate up. Even the ones at the upper end will drop rents because that's what the housing study said. It said there was a dearth of higher end units and that if you built more at the higher end, it would be helpful for reducing rents because it would increase vacancy rates.
I don't know how that plays out in the current market. And you know, I don't watch the market other than what the Zillow emails tell me, but you know, I just don't see, even if we were to, you know, if we got 29 new ADUs in the next year or two, and more than half of them went to rentals, I don't see how that affects the overall supply and demand situation.
Well, it would help those 29 homeowners either stay in their home or buy that home. You know, some of these things are people that are older and they're empty nesters and they have I mean, what is a single person who's retired, do they really need a 2,500 square foot house? And maybe they want to have somebody living in that house to help augment their retirement. So the affordability on the other side is important. Not everybody, I think you have to also give people chances to be owners at some point, if they can make that jump.
right? And each owner that you get is a rental unit that becomes available, right? Because they were renting before. I mean, I agree that we're in a housing situation in all the major metropolitan areas that, we need to construct, thousands of units. I used to say I thought it was probably 1 million in the New York metro area. I think the number might be closer to 500,000. We're 500,000 units short, which is why rents are so high. Can you imagine what would happen if we were 500,000 units available and long? Rents would plummet like the stone. And that's the fundamental here, which is we have to start allowing some density and some construction, not just in this city, but across the entire metropolitan area. And if we can do that, and especially if we build a variety of housing, including smaller rehab units and in existing home structures, that will bring rents down. And then also, as Chris said, it creates affordability for first-time home buyers. What do people want to do? We've been at this for a while.
I mean, I want to get this done because when I look at the planning board having to go through these things, and I mean, I don't know what every consultant gets paid, so it's kind of a hypothetical, but those meetings are expensive. I don't know how much they cost, but there are lawyers and engineers, and I just don't know that we need all of that expertise around refurbishing a garage into a 600 square foot apartment. I don't care whether we call it affordable or not. I get your point with that. And I've heard those arguments. There's kind of a tension between people saying that this doesn't solve affordable housing. I don't know. Every little bit helps. We have to try everything that works to find more housing for people to live in. And this seems like low-hanging fruit.
If I could jump in, it's been a year since we started this conversation. And I wrote a memo back in September 10th, 2021 on this topic, which had 5 ideas that were supposedly low-hanging fruit. And ADUs were the first one on the list because I thought it was the easiest thing to get done. So looking back on that is kind of depressing. I think there have been studies done that show that where large chunks of accessory dwelling units were permitted by streamlining the process, that high percentages of them were below market rate. So it's not just conjecture or anecdotal or, I have a feeling that studies have been done that show that substantial numbers, for 3 West Coast cities, it was 58% were below market rent. For the California study, they were between 12 and 69%. So there are substantial gains to be had if you, on the affordability front, if you allow these things to happen. And I think the antiquated 89 law just needs to be updated so that it's easier to do, and so therefore more people would do it. And we're just spinning our wheels if we keep pushing this thing around. I do want to say one thing. It's one thing to require larger scale developers to subsidize the construction of 10% below market rate. And that's reasonable, 10%. It's out of their pocket, 100%. By comparison, it seems really unfair to require a single-family owner who wants to build one small accessory apartment in their backyard or in their house to be required to do a low-income rental. And that's at 100% of that unit. So it really does seem like, at the very least, we should be streamlining and making the process easier, not making it more difficult and more bureaucratic.
All right. Any other views? What do y'all want to do? You want to go forward with it the way it is with the 2 changes, or do you want to do something else?
I'm happy to go forward with the changes.
Okay.
Me too.
All right.
I'm happy to go forward with the changes.
Okay. Other views?
I'm fine to stick with our public hearing schedule.
Okay. All right.
Can I ask a related question, which might be a total non-starter?
No, then don't.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Well, I thought as we're
Okay.
talking about this, and maybe this is really a question for legal, is it whether or not Beacon would ever want to do that, and I just imagine Chris taking a deep breath right now, is it legally possible in New York State for Beacon to implement a renter's tax credit for small landlords? Like if you had a unit and you chose to rent to someone below a certain AMI, you would get a credit on your city taxes. Could we legally do that? I'm not asking do we want to and the bureaucracy it would involve. I'm just asking if it's a possibility under New York State law.
I understand the question. I believe the answer is no. I will confirm it, but I believe the answer is no, because tax credits can only be given by a municipality if they are authorized by state law.
Right.
And I do not believe there's an existing state law that would authorize that type of a rent credit to be given by a municipality.
Great,
So we'll
thank
take a
you.
look and let you know, but I believe the answer is no.
Yeah.
So assume it's no unless I...
Yeah, I was doing some research. I see New York City has something kind of related, though that gives the tax credit to the renter, not to the landlord. But it's, as we all know, there are lots of laws in New York State that are just for New York City. So thank you, Nick. I would appreciate knowing if that's an option.
There is a bill that was introduced in the state legislature. Who knows, it won't go anywhere, but there's supposedly a pot of money out there for this purpose in the budget. That would, for accessory dwelling units, provide property owners with a forgivable loan of up to $75,000 for 20 years towards construction costs. If the property owner rents the unit to tenants meeting affordable income guidelines for a 20-year period, the fund is forgiven. And then a second component would be a tax credit for property owners with a legal accessory unit who rents it under affordable occupancy rent income guidelines. And then the third aspect of the bill was establish a property tax exemption for property owners who construct legal accessory dwelling units and rent it in accordance with affordable guidelines. And that tax exemption would be equal to 100% of the increase in assessed value for the property attributed to the construction of the unit. So there are people out there who are trying to make this affordable and tying it
To being, yes, to have the benefits, like we were just talking about with Doug, is what is the benefit we can give to the landlord?
Because government it's not just on the local property owner to subsidize this unit. The government would subsidize it and the owner would get credit for it.
Yeah, I mean, that might be, I know this might not be much of something, but I don't know, John, I couldn't quite tell if those are still active bills, but maybe if we could, as a city, at least have a resolution supporting those if they're active. So that could be something we could do towards this idea.
I like that. I already wrote a letter to the governor supporting that particular proposal, because I think it's a good one. And it's a fair one, because it's spreading the cost across
Right.
everybody, right?
Yeah.
That was introduced in April.
Okay, thank you.
That's all I know about it, was this one newspaper article. So I haven't gone through and looked at the bill, and who knows where it is in committee, but.
Yeah, we can look into that. I believe that was mentioned in one of our memos, but I'll get back in touch with Drew and we'll get back to you on that status as well.
Thank you, Nick.
So you have a public hearing on this next week?
All right, so we're gonna, can we get those two changes in that the county recommended into it before the next hearing? Is that all right? Okay.
And then we have Waterbody and Wetland experts on.
Chris wants to go on to number 3, is what he's saying. Are we okay with that,
Because
folks?
the meter is running. Remember that meter Ren
All right.
talked about?
Water, body, and wetland protections, and, oh my goodness, it's not, do we have Jennifer?
Yes, you have Jennifer Gray, one of our city attorneys. Nick, why don't you introduce our...
Great, thank you, Mayor and Chris. So at the council's August 15th work session, Councilmember Danny Montclair had requested an item on green infrastructure to be discussed by the council, and there was a discussion about the regulation and if there was the ability to provide greater protection for stormwater management, for example, wetland protection, zoning setbacks along water bodies, drainage, green infrastructure, a discussion of stormwater pollution prevention plans, what is the city doing with its MS4 requirements. And so when we were discussing at the staff level in response to the city council's comments, we recognized as I was hearing these comments during the August 15th work session that many of these items are already regulated and addressed within the existing city code such as WIPs and the MS4, and also during the planning board's review of subdivisions or site plan. And so we thought it would be appropriate to bring in John Russo and Jennifer Gray, who go to the planning board meetings, to give you an overview of those issues and how they're regulated within the existing code and at the planning board level. So that would then perhaps answer some of the questions that you have, establish that the protection is already there, or you may want to provide greater protections and amend the existing law. So John Russo is a New York licensed engineer who works with the firm of Blank & Tully, and John's firm as being the city's consulting engineer on a variety of projects, not just the planning board engineering consultant, but also on many of the major infrastructure and contract work that gets done. And we've had the pleasure of working with John for over 10 or 15 years. And John attends each of the planning board meetings and provides the planning board with the engineering expertise when site plans and subdivisions are examined to take a look at the drainage, the green infrastructure, stormwater management, items of that matter, as well as working with the city on SWIPs and the MS4 program. And John will explain that in more detail. Jennifer Gray, a colleague and the principal of the firm of Keenan Bean, has been representing the planning board for probably over 5, 7, 8 years, and Jennifer attends each of the planning boards meeting, and Jennifer represents other planning boards throughout the Hudson Valley, and Jennifer also was very familiar with the city's code, the New York State DEC regulations, and the interplay between the regulations, the planning board discretion, the planning board's mandatory obligations to take a look at these issues, how the State Environmental Quality Review Act, SECRA, interplays with the concerns that the council discussed at the August 15th meeting. And so both Jennifer and John are present tonight to provide you with an overview and answer your questions so we can move that discussion along. I don't know who was going to speak first, if it was going to be John or Jennifer.
Nick, can I just interject for 1 second? Part of the request also was to look around what other municipalities in New York State are doing that were not to protect wetlands and water bodies. Is that research ongoing, or is that being presented tonight?
Yes, that research is ongoing and not ready for discussion for tonight.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess unless the council desires otherwise, I'll kick off. Good to see everybody. So I'm going to start off by speaking about wetlands and how your code regulates wetlands and watercourses. I'm going to leave the stormwater discussion for John. That's more within his bailiwick. So as far as wetlands and watercourses go, your current city code regulates them in a couple different ways. Probably the most relevant way is in section 223-16. You have a provision that, I'll paraphrase, essentially says that you can't alter a wetland without review by the planning board. And there's a whole list of things that the planning board is supposed to review in making sure that the alteration to the wetland is appropriate, is mitigated, and is not going to cause any detrimental impact. So some of those things include water pollution, reviewing the impact on aquatic animal and plant life, temperature change, drainage issues, flooding, runoff, erosion, water table levels. There's a whole host of things that are listed in the code that the planning board is charged with the responsibility of reviewing. And this is a list that was at one point developed by the city council at that time as being issues relevant for wetland regulation. There are a couple different other areas in your code where wetlands are addressed. One is in the Fishkill Creek Development District. This is a district that was added in 2010. And the purpose of the district is really to protect the Fishkill Creek and regulate development so that's compatible with its location adjacent to the creek. The creek obviously is a water course, so that is one of the environmental features that is regulated by your code. And there are two, what I think are the most critical provisions in the Fishkill Creek Development District, and that is there's a vegetative buffer that's required to be maintained adjacent to the creek with respect to any development proposal. And that buffer is required to be protected by either a conservation easement or a declaration of restrictive covenants. So something that is recorded with title to the property to make sure that not only the current owner, but future owners of the property understand that that vegetative buffer is to be maintained as a vegetative buffer. And the other significant provision there is a density reduction. So you are, when figuring out your maximum density for a property of 3 acres or more in the Fishkill Creek Development District, you're supposed to subtract out a lot area that contains a certain amount of steep slopes, wetlands, and other environmentally sensitive areas. So that's another way that you're protecting wetlands, is you're reducing density on any property that contains wetlands. You also have in your subdivision code at section 195-20 a requirement that existing natural features of the site that are of ecological or aesthetic or scenic value, so arguably wetlands would be included in that, should be preserved as far as possible through, efficient design of the subdivision. Now, I will say it's not that often that the planning board sees an application that involves a wetland. In fact, in preparing for tonight, I went back through, I know the most recent example is the Beacon Views Coughlin Street application that was just approved by the planning board over the summer. But I was trying to recall whether there were any other applications that I've seen, and I've been representing the planning board since, I think it was about 2011 or 2012 that I started representing the planning board, so a little longer than Nick said. And I couldn't find a single application that involved a wetland. There are not that many wetlands located within the city of Beacon. And those that are governed by, they're regulated by New York State DEC, or by the Army Corps, or both. So you do have a level of protection there that the applicant is going to be required to get permits from one or both of those agencies. I would like to say that on the Beacon Views application, I have to give a plug for the planning board, because I think they really did a fantastic job with that application as it relates to the wetland. In that application, there was, the developer did propose direct disturbance of a wetland that was on site. The applicant originally proposed to mitigate that disturbance with off-site mitigation. So enhancing or creating a wetland somewhere other than on the site where the wetland is being disturbed. And the planning board said that doesn't work for us. No, we want you to mitigate here on site where you're creating the disturbance. And they required a 1-to-1 mitigation. So essentially there's no net loss of wetland as a result of the mitigation proposal that was put forward. And because of that, because they really held their ground and required the 1-to-1 mitigation on site, the developer actually had to reduce the density for the project. So you ended up with a less dense project, less units, and a better protection of the wetlands. So I think they did a great job with utilizing the provision that you currently have in your zoning code, the 223-16. So with that, I think what I'll do, I'll turn it over to John to talk about stormwater and perhaps touch upon floodplain issues. And of course, if you have any questions about wetlands, happy to try to address those.
Good evening, everybody. So with regards to stormwater, EPA developed regulations and passed them down to all the states. And of course, the state passed it on to all the municipalities. So around 2007, the city adopted stormwater laws more or less for the MS4. They were required by the state to adopt laws to look at stormwater, how it's being handled from a site, more or less quality, quantity, to prevent the runoff of pollutants into the existing water courses along the way, and to help protect against flooding from downstream. At that time, the city did adopt laws for the MS4 with regards to stormwater and with regards to illicit discharge. Illicit discharge is with regards to pollutants that you would find running in storm drains, such as somebody pulling up over a catch basin and changing their oil. Could be any other pollutants running out into the watercourse. As part of the MS4 requirements, there are 6 minimum measures that have to be met on an annual basis. One being public education and outreach, and that can be shared by other communities. But basically, I know the Soil and Water Conservation District has put on courses, has gone to schools to reach out to the students. The city has had publications such as flyers, posters, put in different areas within the city hall, and in the past, they used to put out pamphlets at some of the local hardware stores. Number 2 is public involvement, participation. Once again, Riverkeeper, Soil and Water Conservation District, they've held different events as far as cleanings along the rivers or different water courses. You have public involvement when you have projects before the planning board also. People have a chance to speak on all topics related to the project. Third minimum measure is illicit discharge detection and elimination. I have to hand it to the highway department. They go out every year and check every outflow from your stormwater system. And they have to document it and photograph during dry weather seasons or periods and investigate whether there is anything that looks irregular, whether it be an oil sheen or anything else that they may see coming out of the pipes. If they do find it, they have to trace it backwards to find out where it's coming from. Number 4, as far as a minimum measure, is construction site stormwater runoff control. This more or less relates to your erosion and sediment control that has to be employed on the site during the construction of the project. DEC has an entire manual on the methods that have to be employed, and they do evolve over time. They find out from when this was originally developed that there were certain methods out there that they had recommended that didn't work well at all and actually created more problems. So they keep evolving as time goes on. Number 5 is post-construction stormwater management. How are you handling the stormwater that's being developed from the site after it's developed? So you have infiltration systems, bioretention systems, rain gardens, could be green roofs, stormwater ponds. So there's a number of methods that DEC allows for in their design manual. They actually have a design manual that was published in 2015 as the latest manual, Stormwater Design Manual, and they outline what they will allow to be used. The 6th measure is stormwater management for municipal operations. So more or less they're looking at all municipalities and having them look at their facilities, such as the highway garage or any other facilities they have. How are they managing those facilities? Not only stormwater, but washing of vehicles, any chemicals that they may have on site, salt storage, and there's a few other items. So those are the 6 measures that have to be measured on a yearly basis. And I should say also with regards to municipal operations would be the cleaning of parking lots, roads, catch basins. That all gets measured into those operations. As far as development of projects, in the city's code, anything over an acre in size needs to have a stormwater pollution prevention plan prepared, or I would call it a SWIP, is what it's typically called. And in there, they have to develop their flows for the project. So they have to take a look at the site and look at different rainstorm events, typically a 1, a 10, and a 100-year storm event. And look at the flows that come off the site, where do they come off the site now, and then based upon their development, rerun the model and take a look at what would be coming off the site again. And what they have to do is treat the excess that's coming off the site for quality and quantity. I have to give it to a number of the projects that have been coming before us recently. They've more or less been doing a lot of infiltration systems where they're actually keeping everything on site. So there's nothing running off. They've actually reduced the amount of water that is running off the site, and they're either infiltrating it in or reusing it, using it for green roofs, right now 2 cross streets before the planning board, and the new building they're proposing, they have a green roof on that building. And they're also using a parking lot across the way and redeveloping that, and although that has nothing on it right now, they're putting infiltration systems in there to more or less reduce the runoff from that parking lot that exists currently. I'll open it up to questions at this point.
And if I could, just a quick clarification, because I know when we discussed this at one point, I just wanted to make clear that we have a separate stormwater system than our sanitary sewer system. So like you'll read about the city of Newburgh or the city of Kingston having what's called a combined sewer overflow. So if they get a certain rate of precipitation and water going through their system, it actually spills raw sewage into the water bodies that receive that. We don't have that, fortunately. Like when we had the storm last year in September, we ran 18 million gallons of water through what we usually process is 3 million gallons a day, and we didn't spill anything out of that. So we spend a lot of time and money updating, cleaning, televising the storm drain system, and we're actually going to be bringing you some additional projects to fix storm drains, because we've recently found a couple that we need to line with the new pipe. So again, I just want to make clear that we don't have that CSO problem here.
Right, we have had problems in the past, and the city has been working very diligently to eliminate any cross connections between the sanitary sewer and the storm drainage system.
Sorry, they're not fully disconnected?
We don't know of any that are connected at this point in time.
And there's a requirement for any application that comes before the planning board, at least, the applicant is required to provide a certification that they've looked for any illicit connections, any connections from like a sump pump to the storm sewer to the sanitary sewer, and that if there is one found, that is required to be eliminated during the planning board process. So that's one way that we're trying to catch any remaining illicit connections.
Thanks so much for doing this research and going over all this.
Any other questions for them? I know this is part of the puzzle, but it's a good start.
John, could you talk just a little bit about what's below the ground in some areas? Because we had talked about some infiltration, perhaps if we redevelop Veterans Place as a green park. And you had raised some concerns about that being clay or rock. Can you just talk a little bit about why that might not be something we can do everywhere in the city?
So where we can, we try to get developers to do infiltration, other green methods employed. You know, we'd like to infiltrate the water back into the ground. We'd like to avoid sending as much stormwater into the systems and offsite as possible. Some of the concerns we've had, or in certain areas in the city, we've run into pure clay. So in those areas, we can't infiltrate the water into the ground. We're going to wind up digging a pool, putting the water in. It's not going to infiltrate into the ground. Next storm comes along and it just blows over and fails. I'm concerned with the area as far as Veterans Place, because we did some sewer replacements in that area, and when we dug down, we had pure gray clay under the road.
Thank you.
And what do we know about the banks along the creek? Because the requirement that I saw was for 100 for properties that are 100 feet from water bodies. So the clay would be at the foot of the slope, right? Not at the top?
The clay would be at the foot of the slope. Anything that occurred along the Fishkill Creek has either been an infiltration bioretention system or infiltration system that's been installed along that area. the parking lot off of Churchill Street. That's a bioretention, planted bioretention for water quality, and it actually infiltrates through the bottom of that system. Some of the other developments that have occurred along there have also been using bioretention infiltration. So we seem to have good soils along the creek line and down along the river. It's mainly in the heart of the city that we have problems, or then when we go up onto the mountain, we have rock. DEC has certain requirements that you have to have certain separation requirements between the bottom of the system and the rock. And if you can't meet that, they won't allow you to employ certain methods to be used.
Thanks.
Now, Dan, I know you also had some questions with regards to other available sources. I know a few good sources would be the County Soil and Water Conservation District offices, the EPA. I also learned the Hudson Valley Regional Council also takes a look at water quality. They have a source for that. And I have been looking around for some other things. Just Department of State has also put out a document from June of 2019 that had some different provisions for model stormwater management and erosion control for community resiliency, and some other items as far as reducing impervious surfaces, protection of steep slopes, and if you'd like, I can forward that document to you.
Thanks, that'd be great. Everybody, please.
Yes, yes.
I have a
Chris, you
call.
want me to just send
Yeah,
it to
you can just send it to me, John. And I have a call with Soil and Water on Wednesday because I was going to ask them to go through our code and say, what are we missing? Do you have any thoughts on this? So there is a county agency, Soil and Water, that meets on a regular basis, on a monthly basis with all the municipalities that are MS4, and they do a lot of the outreach and education on it. So, cool.
I'll also send along a second document. It's titled Town of Wappinger Recommended Model Development Principles for Conservation of Natural Resources. And this was developed in June of 2006 by a partnership of DEC, the Center for Watershed Protection, and a few other groups. And it might have some information that you may be looking for also.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay. I got 3 more to go, but I think they're easier. There's a resolution in support of an assembly bill and a state senate bill. And how are we going to do that?
You have the chair of the Conservation Advisory Committee on, and he's going to speak to this. This is regarding crypto mining and the heavy energy usage from that industry. Sergey, you're on?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for taking time to hear this issue out. This came to our attention a couple months ago after some conversations with Food and Water Watch and just like watching the press that was looking into cryptocurrency and increased operation of gas-powered electrical facilities. And what started to occur, a lot of older facilities started to get taken over by investment firms that would run them exclusively or close to exclusively to generate power to run computer farms to power Bitcoin operations or other proof of work cryptocurrencies. And I can explain what that means if people want to know a little bit about cryptocurrencies and the difference between proof of work and how they work and why they need so much power. And some issues started coming up further in Adirondacks, in the Finger Lake area, in Dresden, New York. So there was a case where an old pickup plant, similar to our dance cameras, that was only operating a little bit at peak, during peak times, was taken over by investment firm from Connecticut and started running like at about half or three-quarters to its capacity. And they renewed it. It was cleaner per kilowatt of electricity it produced, but because it was running so much, pollution around in the lakes, that region started to increase. And DC eventually refused to grant them a renewal permit based on the fact that they were mostly running it to power their own crypto mining operation. Since then, after lobbying by environmental groups and the affected municipalities, the Assembly and Senate have passed a bill that would put a 2-year moratorium on renewal of permits for existing facilities and permits and issuance of permits for new facilities that use fossil fuels to generate electricity, primarily to power proof of work cryptocurrency operations. And this summer, it was passed by both the Senate and the Assembly. Jacobson, our Assembly representative, is one of the co-sponsors and has voted in support of it. So far, the Governor Hochul haven't called this bill to her table and has not signed it. Some people in her administration are supported by cryptocurrency operators, as was reported by the press. And so we're hoping to create a momentum to have this bill signed. And I can give you a couple-minute overview of what cryptocurrency, proof of work cryptocurrencies do and why they need electricity. If council members and others feel they want to learn a little more about it.
Yeah, I think giving the public a 101 on what the heck this is would be helpful. And by what the heck, I mean the blockchain and what proof of work means and why it uses so much energy.
So let me do the 1-minute version of that one, all right? I work in payments. So in order to create a cryptocurrency using something called a blockchain, basically it required some way of limiting the number of units, call them dollars, call them bitcoins, call them whatever you want. So the way they came up with this was to solve problems on a computer. And it relates to how the settlement occurs, but basically, you can talk about things like a Bitcoin being somehow better than other payment systems, but they're incredible users of computer horsepower, just absolutely incredible. And what Sergey is referring to is all of the energy use associated with churning through more and more computer cycles to mine a coin. And that coin is, remember, it's just a way of limiting the supply so that there's a price stability. So that's the simple version. You want to add anything else, or is that good enough for us to go forward? So it's just huge. It's just a huge power use for no particularly good reason.
I've read a statistic recently that the amount of energy used by cryptocurrency mining exceeds the total amount of energy from all solar installation globally. So like all the solar panels in the world couldn't keep up with crypto mining.
Yeah. And if you really try to understand what the replacement of a national currency is with a alternative currency, once you get to the power usage, it's just unbelievable and just silly. So yeah, I'm all for this one. It's an easy one.
So we can have a vote on that resolution next week and forward it to the governor's office.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised it hasn't been signed. That just strikes me as a no-brainer. So.
Yeah.
There was one typo in our resolution. It said year, 2 year somewhere.
We'll grab it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sergey. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ran, you're up. You want to talk about the Dutchess County Housing Trust Fund?
Yes, thank you. So earlier this year, I presented you with the findings of the Dutchess County Housing Needs Assessment that CBZ consultants completed. And as we talked about earlier, they found that the greatest need was for rental housing for those under $50,000 per year. But as we talked about earlier, there were other gaps that were driving up competition for that same group. And they put us, meaning the county, on alert to catch up. The number they gave to catch up was 2155 interventions that would need to take place. They recommended those be incremental, and a fair share approach should be applied to determine how many each municipality would need to take on for over 20 years. So keep in mind that we could certainly do more than catch up, and that doesn't mean the same as keep pace, because the gap between income and housing costs continues to rise. So that said, Beacon's fair share was 105 units, and that's about 5 a year for 20 years. And CBZ's needs assessment recommended that the county create a housing trust fund and fund it at $2 million per year. And they made some broad recommendations about what the eligibility should be for those funds, but mainly their overlay was let it be flexible. And so, current day, the legislature, the Dutchess County Legislature, has passed a resolution to establish a housing trust fund, and they've allocated for the initial funding $12.3 million. And that's partially funded by the American Rescue Plan Act funds. The purpose of the Housing Trust Fund pot is for affordable housing to low and moderate income residents. So that's less than or equal to 60% AMI. And if you want to look up how AMI works, you can Google Fannie Mae's AMI lookup tool. But it comes to, as Doug said earlier, 65,000. The aim of the Housing Trust Fund is to create affordable housing through Dutchess County, leverage it with other funding sources, support, the pot should support where other funding is unavailable or limited, and the county will prioritize higher affordability. So there are 3 programs. They are distinct with their eligibility criteria, and I can go into that if we want to and talk about the eligibility criteria for each of the programs, but I'll just go over briefly. They are the Housing Creation and Preservation Program and the Infrastructure and Pre-Development Support Program and the First Time Home Ownership Program. So the legislature will appropriate funds yearly. And, I did say it was $12.3 million, and $3 million is from the ARP and 9.3 from the fund balance. So our mayor and city administrator, thank you for expressing an interest in building affordable housing since our first conversation about this. And I know each member of the council agrees. It's just a matter of how. So that brings us to the info on the first funding round, which is, I'll just read it from the press release. Upon the creation of the Housing Trust Fund, the first application round will encompass 2 of the eligible activities from within the Housing Creation and Preservation Program: the creation of new affordable rental housing through new construction, rehabilitation, or adaptive reuse, and acquisition and/or rehabilitation of occupied, naturally occurring affordable rentals. This initial application round is expected to be released in late September. So, just to summarize, I appreciate the investment that the county is making, and I think their criteria for each of the programs that they've created is thought through, it's clever, clearly experienced advocates with Ann and Heather in that office. They're, experienced in advocating for low and moderate housing creation, and they listened to the good advice from the consultants and looked at what the data analysis turned up. So I think we need more of this, and we need to stay on top of the legislature to make sure that they appropriate appropriately, since it doesn't have to be spent in the year it's appropriated. So I think it will grow and grow in significance. And that is the very brief summary. Any questions?
What is the application process, and how do we get it done?
I guess they'll announce that in September. Chris, how does this sort of work from the county? How do we stay on top of that?
I don't know how they managed it. I mean, it may go through private developers, or the mayor and I spoke to the planning department about the infrastructure piece, because we thought infrastructure typically is water and sewer, and we've already got water and sewer everywhere. And what we were asking them about is, what if we need a structure parking deck to allow for a redevelopment of a parking lot, for instance? And I think they were considering it. I don't know that they've made any decisions on it.
And I'm curious now, after hearing from Doug, what, if any, rehab or acquisition of those naturally occurring affordable units that are not already subsidized for low-income tenants could there be? There might be one, there might be none, but I would be interested to circle back with Doug on that before the September funding round is released, just so that we kind of know if there's anyone out there who wants to rehab their buildings but keep their rentals low. Seems unlikely, but possible.
Depends on how much money they have and what the rates are. It was Doug and it was CPC that we talked to that let us know that parking was considered infrastructure in Westchester. And that gave us the idea of, okay, we should ask for it here, because, as Chris said, the infrastructure program, otherwise we just don't have much use for. And we shouldn't be penalized for having done the homework over the last 20 years. So
I agree.
I thought these parking garages were part of the Phase 3 of the Main Street Access Committee, that they would only be implemented if we didn't have any success after Phase 1 and 2. Because it was the Main Street Access Committee gave Phase 1, which were the quick wins, Phase 2, which are going to take a little more investment, and Phase 3 was like, if nothing else works, we could do this.
that would be for additional parking, right? What Chris was suggesting was if we had a lot, what you'd want to do is maintain the parking spaces for the public use on that lot and build up.
Right.
And so it's more expensive.
Obviously, it's expensive
so
to do that.
A variance.
So
but that was in Phase 3 that I saw. That was the parking lots behind
no,
the health center. And
Phase 3 would have, from the Main Street Access Committee's report, would have built a standalone parking structure either off Eliza Street, or there was another one contemplated over by the DMV building. What we're talking about, say you were to build a building on a lot and you had surface parking all around it. That cost has a variance above it if you're going to build over that lot. So for instance, John Clark has a proposal to build apartments or mixed use over the Churchill lot, and it would actually create a new connection from that building directly onto Main Street, which is kind of cool. There's a premium to building that building if you build on piers and go over the existing parking. So what we were suggesting is that if the Housing Trust Fund could pay for that parking piece of it, it would make the development more viable.
I would be shocked if they don't agree.
Yeah, it's a little harder than sewer and water, but we're not talking about a standalone like facility. That would have been in phase 3, and I don't know that that's necessary. We're talking about on-site subterranean parking, kind of like they did at Creek Drive, where Rodney redeveloped the old highway garage. All the parking for that's under the building.
Everything you said makes sense to me, and maybe I'm just misreading this press release, but it looked to me like it was saying that the HCP program was the first one that was going to be up, and we're talking about the IPDS program.
Right, that's a very good point. So
traffic parking.
Right.
Right, we have more role, though, in the infrastructure piece, so that's why that grabbed our attention earlier. Because we don't have another project, like, on the back burner ready to pull out.
But we could work with the Beacon Housing Authority potentially on their projects, is that right? Or we don't need to be directly involved in there?
Our involvement would be if they choose to move forward, we would help to create the zoning changes that would allow it.
Got it.
I'm not sure they want to move forward. There's a discussion about whether they want the increased density and whether it would fit in. So their board came and met with me last week, and I said, look, this is up to you. I think the council would be supportive of considering a zoning change if it would allow for good development there. You decide what good development is. And so they're trying to figure out what's an appropriate scale, how would they build it. They've had a couple partners come in and show them different ways they could, take the existing parking lot and build over it. So again, I'll reach out to Ron and let him know about this, and maybe that's a catalyst for that. Because it could bring down, one of their concerns was to have a viable project, they needed a certain number of apartments. And if funding could be allocated through this program, it might bring that point down so it's not quite as dense and therefore maybe more palatable to people on their board. Instead of 50 apartments, 30. And, again, you're trying to pay for all of this infrastructure.
Do you have any sense of what their concern is with density? Or do they just feel like they don't have the staff to manage more units, or?
I think it was, what I heard is they felt it would change their neighborhood. Because they have, they have the one tower at Forrestal Heights, but then they have kind of low-rise family housing, and they felt that the additional density could change the flavor of that, and it's where they're looking at doing it is up against another neighborhood. Eliza Street, I don't think they really have much place to expand.
Yep.
And they started the conversation because they wanted us to think about giving some parkland from South Avenue Park. That's very difficult because it takes an act of the legislature basically to quote-unquote alienate parkland, to take it from being parkland and make it something else. The other thing is we're not making any more parkland, and I don't want to, I was loath to give away parkland in an area that already is a low-income hub for the city, where I think we need more recreation and park rather than less. So we said, why don't you try to build it on your site without coming onto our park?
When do you expect we'll hear back?
I don't know. I can check in with them.
I want to give room for other people to have questions or reactions. But I have kind of a sideways, maybe naive question. I'm going to go for it. So I know that there's this trend with the Section 8 program moving to a voucher system, that those who are in Section 8 housing are moving out of particularly managed buildings and into more privately owned, potentially homes. Would this housing creation and preservation program potentially benefit the landlords of Section 8 voucher holders, or is this totally separate?
I don't know. The vouchers were talked about as a part of, because they're going to be very flexible with how they allocate, I think that they would. But you're asking, would it benefit landlords?
Well-
I mean, I think that they are looking at more voucher creation, but do you mean benefit landlords to create more units?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through thinking about this in any direction possible, how to make it better and easier for both landlords and tenants to use the Section 8 program. I know that there are a number of people who have vouchers in Beacon, but can't find housing to use them in, and just trying to think through how to make it easier on both ends.
Well, so in Beacon is the tricky part to that statement. But in Dutchess County, overall, the whole point is to create more low and moderate income housing. So they're not necessarily focused on voucher programs because it's a separate track. But they might be getting to that. That was a recommendation. And I'm just looking.
You know, hypothetically, if someone wanted to build an ADU and committed to having it be used for Section 8 housing voucher holders, could they get funding through this program to build that ADU?
Right now, it doesn't. They haven't released any information that they could, but it was a strategic recommendation in the report. So that's a question.
Yeah, that money was at the state level, was in the governor's budget. It came out, but I bet you it's going to come back, right? And it makes sense at a state level, but it's exactly that, which is, if you do this, you'll get access to some lower cost funding or some grant, but here's what you have to do in return.
Right.
But yeah, let's see it, and maybe the county will do it. That's interesting. So.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, I will ask where that discussion went, and because now I'm looking at the strategy recommendations, and every other recommendation is here in the report. So I don't think I missed it. But the consultants recommended subordinate mortgages to support affordable home ownership. That's here in eligibility. Tax exemption policies, that's here as a recommendation, as well as density and inclusionary subsidies for mixed use. Yeah. Rehab for existing rentals. And GIS, I always get that wrong, the GEIS.
Generic environmental impact statement.
Yes, the funds can be used to streamline affordable housing because I don't know if this is an issue in Beacon, but a lot of the other municipalities have some bottleneck in that process. So Housing Trust Fund dollars can be used to assist in that streamlining process if the municipality also is putting in other strategies like density bonuses and inclusionary zoning, which we do.
Is there an interest in creating some sort of roadmap to get to 105 units in 20 years, or are there just too many unknown variables to even begin to do something like that?
Yes.
Looking at you.
I don't think there are too many unknown variables. I think a roadmap would be interesting to explore, and I think that your questions for Doug, Molly, are kind of going to be illuminating, because the council will look at those numbers and you'll see in real terms what that avenue could look like. And we could look at every single one of these eligibility criteria and figure out, do we have something here that's eligible? And again, I emphasize that we're not limited to 5 a year. That's just the way that the consultants were illustrating the scale of the problem countywide. So.
Right, but the reason they did fair share, right, was to get the towns to get off their duffs. right? Because all of the work so far has been done by the two cities, right? And we've got, was it 29% of our housing stock, of our rental stock is supported or subsidized in some fashion. And so, there's sort of limits, right?
Absolutely.
It sounds like it's the third phase of funding will be the first-time home ownership, but I did wonder in that, to Chris's point earlier, what options we have for a city in that, particularly if you're, I'm curious to know more about the quickness of that. One of the challenges sometimes with private landlords taking on Section 8 is that it does require additional paperwork, and so they're not motivated or incentivized to take on those tenants if they have enough other people applying. And so I'm wondering, too, with first-time homeowners, I don't know what housing stock we have that is for sale that's coming on. I know that generally housing sales have slowed down because of the increase in mortgages, so there might, I don't know the timing of when they'll be available, but there might be some housing stock that is within range if there is a down payment. But how do we as a city then, can we use this funding to set up a system to help people get that money in a timely manner, so the seller's like, I would sell to you, but I can't wait 6 months for this thing to clear, or whatever the timing is. So wanting to know more about streamlining it as you were talking about, and might there be something there where there might be housing coming online that we could take advantage of that and move people out of rental units into first-time home ownership.
I'm also really interested in rent-to-own models, which is, I think, in my mind, another way of exactly what you're saying, Molly, is just spreading out the cash flow needed by the
it's really popular in European countries. I know. I'm not sure if we have them here in New York State or how they work. So.
But regardless, the same question as you have, is there a way for the state to help manage that cash flow?
Yeah.
And again, kind of back to Lee's points, we are, I hate to use the word competing, but essentially we're not the
target.
Yeah, we're not the center of this problem that, but on, the same argument, we do bring a lot to the table in terms of infrastructure as well. So I think that's something great to explore. We should explore everything. What the county would be looking for, I think, is bang for the buck in Beacon, and that's going to be a harder thing to illustrate.
Are there areas, I know that we already use our water and sewage, at least our water, if not our sewage system, to support areas that are outside of our city boundaries. Is there opportunity to offer that in a way that benefits Beacon in some way, but then helps incentivize? There might be some land that could be developed for housing that then we can help provide the infrastructure that the county might be. Some partnership with Fishkill, border East Fishkill, but Fishkill and Wappinger that we could help with that in terms of creating housing that's not on Beacon, but then we provide water and sewage. I don't know if this goes anywhere, but
we don't reach Wappingers, so it would only be Fishkill.
Okay.
It's like Dutchess Junction in some areas in Glenham, and
that might involve the Texaco property, which could potentially have a lot of housing on it.
Yeah, I think you'd face some opposition from the leaders in Fishkill about that.
Yeah.
They were concerned about the development of that area.
Yeah, I was on a committee for about 7 years, every month, talking about the potential for that.
I mean, we explored two things with the housing. I actually brought Rupco from Ulster County a few months ago to look at the site where they now want to build 13 houses off of Townsend, where the old Knights of Columbus was. And they had actually reached out to me about possible places they could have smaller units, 800, 1,000 square foot, first-time rental places with a lot of common space, and it would look almost like a European co-housing model. And you keep the cost low because you're sharing a lot of land. You're basically having a smaller footprint. And before they could even act, that property sold out from under them, and then now it's single-family homes that will be $750,000. The other thing that the mayor and I talked to CPC about is whether they were aware of any models where we created instead of building rental housing over parking lots, build condominiums that would have a low entry point for new owners. And they were a little intrigued by that. There's a lot of complex pieces in condominiums and getting financing. It actually sounded like townhouses might be easier, but it's also harder to build townhouses over parking because they run with the land. So we were trying to explore ways to have that entry point for younger people, because in Europe they do that a lot. They have a lot of programs where, you know, they help younger people build equity.
Okay. Enough of that one?
Yeah.
More to come? Yeah, so, you know, a lot of tonight's meeting is conceptual stuff that we're going to keep working on. So let's do the last one, which is a citywide speed limit discussion. Nick, you're going to tell us all of the things that we have to do to have this discussion, right?
More dummy lights, right, Nick?
Yeah. Dummy lights or dummy return? I wasn't sure what you said.
I said more dummy lights?
Yes. Good. So good evening. So in the council's packet is a memo from our office, as well as a copy of the law that was adopted by the governor's chapter 496 on August 12th, about a month ago, that finally authorizes municipalities in New York State to offer a speed limit lower than 30 miles an hour. You may recall from our prior discussions, this legislation has been pending for a number of years before different governors about the movement. And with, I think, increased recognition of the benefit of lower speeds for pedestrian and bicycle safety, this legislation received further support this year, so it was passed by both the Assembly and the Senate and signed into law. Our memo sets forth now what are the next steps. The Council started that discussion and asked us to do so, so we provided that memorandum. And so the city has the authority to reduce the speed limit either citywide or on specific streets to 25 miles an hour. It cannot be done on streets that are owned by the state or the county. It can be done on all city streets. However, to do that, it's not as simple as just adopting a law, holding a hearing, reducing it from 30 to 25. The law requires that a traffic engineer, licensed New York State traffic engineer, undertake an examination of what are the potential impacts to safety and traffic movement from reducing that speed limit, and that they do so by issuing a report that they've certified. And so that requires a number of factors be examined. For example, traffic lights. If the speed is now reduced from 30 to 25, is there enough time, if the car is going 5 miles an hour slower, for those cars to get through the traffic light under the time that is allotted, or do you need to expand that signal time? And so if it was previously 30 seconds that it was green, does it now need to be 35 to 40 seconds as an example? A traffic engineer then has to look at that. If you do that at one traffic light, what is the impact of other traffic lights? Because especially in the city where your lights and intersections are potentially closer than they are at other, a town or a village, what is that impact? So you can't just look at one intersection in isolation. You need to examine it in a number of different roadway configurations. And it's not just the signal timing, how many cars can get under a traffic light while it's green, but also what is the queuing? How many cars queue up so that if you now now that time is reduced, cars queue up, is there enough stacking lanes so that it's safe? Or is there a potential that you now have a car, one extra car lane that's sticking out into a road that is a traffic safety hazard? Does that queue, now because it's potentially longer, block a street and prevent someone from coming out? Or does it create a sight line distance issue where a car turning onto the road, their safety sights are now blocked or limited to viewpoints? So it's not as easy as it would appear just from adopting that law. There's a number of engineering issues that need to be examined, including the sight lines from if there's a hill or a crest. Is that now affected because people are going slower? I wouldn't think so, but it's again something that needs to be looked at. And the reason we want to make sure it's done also is not just for safety, but also protect the city from liability. If the city were to reduce the speed limit and not go through this exercise, it would be exposing itself to potential liability should there an accident occur. And these are the questions we also ask when there are requests for stop signs or other pedestrian or vehicle and traffic signs. New York State has a traffic safety manual that the police department and traffic engineers and your traffic safety committee are familiar with and examine when these questions come up. So the city, the next steps would be for the city to consider, does it wish to pursue this, and is now the time to do that, or is it citywide? Are there specific intersections, or do you want a traffic engineer to come in here and perhaps explain it in more detail than I have? I've learned this knowledge from attending far too many night meetings from planning boards and zoning boards and legislative bodies, so I have an inkling of what's involved. The traffic engineer can give you a better sense, obviously. And I've just given you a number based upon my experience, what I expect that study would cost, and I expect it would take a number of months because they would need to have, put the traffic monitoring strips down on the road to count the traffic volumes, determine what it is during the peak periods, because traffic at 1 p.m. is certainly different than traffic at 8 a.m. or 5 p.m. And it's also different during the summer versus different during the school year. So a number of factors that go into that. So that, Mayor, is just an overview. You have the authority, but there comes some homework that needs to be done before those changes can be made.
The one question I had is, but we can't do anything about state roads, right? Or is it state and county? Although I don't think the only ones that matter are 9D and 52, is that right? Those are the two.
Parts of.
Yeah, right?
Parts of. But
well, all
Nick
of 9D.
No, it's not all of 9D.
It's only the arterial?
Yeah. I believe so.
Do you know now what the boundaries? I had that question too. What are the?
Because I mean, we have
control?
we have an agreement with NISDOT to take care of the arterial, and it's only from the northern boundary of the city to South Avenue. From South Avenue further.
I'd like to get some clarification on that, right? So.
Yeah, I'll call the regional engineer. And
yeah.
And the same thing with 52. Is 52 the full length? Or
that one I'm more certain we have full control over because we're paying for the entire project to redo Fishkill Avenue.
So we have full control over up to Prospect, and then it might become a state
I think
road.
we control all of it,
Confirm
but
that.
I'll check.
What was that, Nick?
Yeah, I was just going to confirm what Chris just said, that's our understanding, but we should confirm that with the county and the state.
Okay.
My question was, if we did do this citywide traffic study, how does that study overlap with other traffic studies that might be in the works, or could we use that data to, for example, change speed limits on other streets? My understanding, for example, for Wilkes Street along Memorial Park, there has been anecdotal interest in lowering the speed limit there since it's a park, but a traffic study was required to even begin to move forward on that. So would this citywide study then give us a base point to potentially look at speed limits elsewhere in the city?
It would, and if you did it citywide, it would. There's a difference between land use project traffic study and the traffic study we're talking about. Okay. For a land use project, we're looking at it in a different fashion. For example, we're looking at existing traffic volumes as well as traffic volumes from traffic they would be adding to that particular intersection. You wouldn't know that for all of the intersections, what projects might be proposed to doing a citywide traffic study. They would just assume a typical percentage background increase. But to answer your question, once you have this study, it could be used for the purposes you're suggesting.
Thanks.
A similar question, Nick, and you might have just answered this in what Paloma asked, but if we did a citywide study, but then could we then use that study to only propose changes on certain streets? We wouldn't have to do the individual streets one?
No, that's correct. You could either decide to do individual streets now, and then a traffic engineer would say, if you do, one street, whatever streets would potentially be impacted by that. But if you do a full citywide study, that doesn't mean you're limited then just to increase it 25 miles throughout the city. You could have to, when you see the results, say, no, let's slow this down, pardon the pun. Let's just do it on a certain number of streets.
You can really do that? You can do a survey of the whole city and then pick a couple streets from that?
Yes, a traffic engineer would verify that for you, but if you're doing the totality, you could certainly then break that down into certain areas because you would have that information for 3 or 4 intersections. You couldn't do the reverse. You couldn't do partial and then
Sure.
do it citywide.
Okay, thanks. Oh, could we, I think this might have already been asked in another version, but could we do a survey that looks at switching the whole city to 25 miles an hour and then selecting, like, you know, a survey of Main Street and streets adjacent to the parks for different speed limits?
Yes, but they could not be lower than 25 miles an hour.
You can go lower than 25 as long as you do a study, right? I think the law says citywide speed limit, because we were allowed to do individual streets lower than 30 miles an hour before, but we couldn't change the citywide speed limit before.
No, the citywide can only be down to 25, and we're not allowed to go on individual streets below 25.
Unless you do a school zone or something.
All right, I'll take a look, because there is a carve-out process where you can have streets that are lower, and I'll just have to look up what that process was.
Yeah, I'll do the same thing.
We could only go to 25 previously if we had an authorization through the state legislature. Because I remember we had that conversation with James about whether or not.
Yeah, but you can see that on page 2 of the state legislation, starting on line 5, where they give you, for example, in the city of Long Beach, where it could be less than 50, it could be 15 miles an hour.
When I was talking to Skoufis's office about this, Senator Skoufis's office about this, they were saying that, you know, we were talking about doing 20 miles an hour on Main Street, which was a recommendation of the Main Street Access Committee, and I said, you know, well, we would just, you know, we could already do this now, right? We could do this without a study. And his office said, well, the point of putting this into the law is then you wouldn't have to do a study at all. It's like this, you would circumvent the study by doing the 20 mile an hour Main Street directly through Albany. Because we have a process already in which we could have done it with a study. But I didn't ask for any of the, you know, the proof of what they were telling me, so I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
I'm supportive of the study generally, though.
All right, let's see if we can collect some more information on it and see if we can then come back with a more fleshed out version of what we want to do. Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's it. We good?
Yeah.
Everybody ready to go home? Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you all. Let's call it a night. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Motion to adjourn?
Yeah, I need a motion to adjourn a workshop.
He never convened it.
All right, motion to adjourn the workshop.
Motion?
Second.
All right, so I think I heard Paloma and Dan. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Let's get those on record.
This is your first...
You know, it looks like the only